Okay, welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hebrew-Kivering, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. I also wanted to introduce my co-coordinators, Story Oates, who's behind the scenes, and Mabel Baldwin-Schaefer, who will be helping me also with questions. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska, our partners, and the communities we work with in Alaska, and how we connect with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. This school year, we're presenting short series of webinars that are more regionally based so that we can focus on topics of interest to those regions of Alaska. We're aiming to present perspectives from the communities we work with, as well as research conducted by students in addition to established scientists. We hope this gives you a look at different communities as well as different career paths you might be interested in. Today, we're presenting the first webinar in our series for the North Slope with a presentation by Dave Kimmel, who works for NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, Washington. While we'll be talking about NOAA's and partners' roles in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we're all coming to you from the traditional lands of Indigenous communities who have substantial traditional and local knowledge and much to share with us. In Alaska, Dave's work is conducted in the Beaufort, Chukchi, and Bering Seas and the Gulf of Alaska, which include the traditional home waters of the Inupiat, Yupik, Siberian Yupik, Inunga, Alutiiq, Sagpiaq, Eyak, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people who have stewarded their lands and waters for thousands of years. We would also like to acknowledge that Dave is presenting from, and we're hosting this webinar from, the traditional lands of the Coast Salish, including the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. Mabel is joining us from Benta, or Wasilla, the ancestral lands of the Dena'ina and Ahtna peoples, and Story is joining us from Juneau, where the Akwaan and the Takupuang Tlingit people have been stewards of their traditional homelands and waters for thousands of years. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speaker. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure that everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions, and we encourage you to ask them as we go along. My colleagues Story and Mabel and I will be keeping track for Dave. He'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We might not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. And I also wanted to remind folks that we have a word search activity handout. I was hoping that you could download it from the platform, but I forgot to load it up. So I will send it out by email. So I will hand it over now to Dave to introduce himself.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Hopefully you can see my screen, and if you have any questions, of course, we have folks that are going to be helping to navigate you with that. So I want to give a little outline of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about myself, who I am, what my job is, and then I'll spend a little bit of time talking about who zooplankton are and why they are important in the environment. And I'll talk a lot about how we study zooplankton and how do we take that information and apply what we learn to help understand the environment and manage fisheries. And then the last part, I want to ask you to think about what a world without plankton might look like, particularly a world without zooplankton, which would be pretty sad for me since that's my job, but that's something that I want you to think about as we go through this particular talk. So a little bit about myself. I'm originally from Pennsylvania. I was born in State College and actually grew up a little bit south of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And from there, I went to Penn State University, where I got a degree in biology and specifically in ecology. And then I went to the University of Maryland, where I got my PhD in the early 2000s. And from there, I did a lot of work on the Chesapeake Bay and a lot of work in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's a shot of me there at Horn Point Laboratory, where I did a bunch of work. And then I moved to East Carolina University in 2008, where I was a professor for about 8 years until I took a job with NOAA and arrived here about 6 years ago, almost right on my 6-year anniversary of being an employee in Alaska Fisheries Science Center. So I've traveled around a little bit, been a few different places, and now my job here is to do research oceanography. And my job basically entails looking at all of the zooplankton data from all of Alaska's large marine ecosystems. And so that's a picture of me on board the ship that you'll see a little bit later, doing some zooplankton work. And we went out last year, and you can see we were all masked up for safety on the vessel. And my job is to essentially take all this information that we learn about zooplankton and make sure that we understand how the ecosystem is functioning, and we understand how we can manage the ecosystem effectively so that we can continue to have all of the major benefits of the ecosystem for society. So I'm going to show you a short video now, and I'm going to switch over to the video. And this is just going to introduce plankton to you a little bit, and it'll mute me while I stop, and you can enjoy this little video before we move forward.
Plankton comes from the Greek word planktos, which means wandering. Any living creature carried along by ocean currents is classified as plankton. It ranges in size from the tiniest virus to siphonophores, the longest animals in the world, and also includes microscopic algae, krill, or fish larvae. Some plankton, like these salps, drift all their lives. Others, like mollusks and fish, are only planktonic during their embryonic or larval state. When they reach adulthood, they settle or swim freely. Planktonic organisms play important roles in human life. Many microscopic species get their energy from photosynthesis. They absorb carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Thus, they constantly renew the air we breathe. Plankton has also been a great provider of fossil energy. When it dies, it sinks to the seabed. This layer of sediment has fossilized for more than 1 billion years, producing our precious oil. Finally, plankton nourishes us. It's the basis of the food chain in which the large eat the small. Without plankton, there would be no fish.
Okay, I
hopefully.
was getting
Yep.
a couple of messages that some people weren't seeing the videos. So it may be that for those who weren't able to see the video, that it was behind one of your other windows. But we'll try to put these videos onto the website afterwards as well.
Okay. All right, so that just gives you a basic introduction of who zooplankton are. And what I want to do now is just walk through some images of what zooplankton are, just to introduce you to a little bit further of all the different creatures. So it's a huge group, and zooplankton essentially means animals that live in the plankton. And the definition of a planktonic organism is any organism that can't swim against the currents. In other words, it's drifting with the water, and that's what the Greek word planktos means, drifter. And so I'm going to show you some different types of plankton here. This picture here is of copepods. They are small crustaceans similar to crabs or shrimp, but they're very tiny, typically around 1 millimeter, and they are probably the most abundant multicellular animal on the planet. So there's more copepods than any other type of animal on the planet. If you consider the ocean as 70% of the planet, lots of these guys are swimming around in the surface. So their estimated abundance is in the tens of trillions. So you're talking about a lot of individuals. And they form the basis of the food web. They feed on algae and they become fish food, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Lots of plankton are parasitic. In particular, copepods are a group that has very large numbers of parasites. And so the one in the top left here, this is a sea lice, and you can see it has these suction cups that it will use to attach, and then these claw-like features that we'll use to embed in the gills of fish. And then one of my favorites down here is this shark, and this is a Greenland shark, and it has a species of zooplankton, a copepod, that lives in its eyes. So this copepod actually digs its appendages into the eyeball, and that's where it lives. So lots of interesting creatures. This is krill. Krill or euphausids are extremely abundant organisms in the environment, and they become some of the primary forage for many whale species. If you go to Antarctica, krill are actually at the very top of the food web. So they're a very large fraction because there's not a lot of forage fish around Antarctica. And so krill form a major source of protein for all the creatures that live there, seabirds, whales, and even humans will harvest krill to extract the oil that they have in them for dietary supplements. Lots of plankton that only spend part of their lives as part of the plankton. And that's usually because they are, oh yeah, sorry, I saw the chat come up. A lot of plankton spend only part of their lives in the plankton, and that's for dispersal. So if you can imagine you're a polychaete worm that's living in the sediment, or a clam, you want to disperse your young away from the place where you are. And so these young will basically spend some time in the plankton, drift around, and eventually they'll metamorph into a different stage, and they'll settle out of the water column and either become adult clams or barnacles or polychaetes. And so there's a group of plankton that live in the plankton full time, and there's a group that only spend part of their time in the plankton. Plankton covers almost every single biological phylum that we have. There's lots of plankton that belong to crustaceans, that's the main group, but here's a group that belongs to gastropods, which is the Greek word that means stomach foot. And so these are snails, and lots of snails are planktonic. This one is called Limacina. And Limacina is a very important organism because its shell that you see here, this shell that reminds you of a snail, is made out of calcium carbonate. And so as the ocean becomes more acidic due to the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the shells of these organisms begin to dissolve at different rates. They become deformed, and it's one of our indicators that the world is having, that the plankton are responding to some of the changes we're making to the atmosphere. Plankton can also be really neat looking and pretty terrifying. This is the head of an arrowworm, and this arrowworm is a small planktonic organism. It's only about a few millimeters in length, but it's predatory. And this is the business end. It has grasping appendages that you can see here, and very powerful jaws. And so even at this really small scale, the dynamic between predator and prey is still going on in the environment. So we have herbivores, we have carnivores, we have all sorts of organisms interacting at this very small scale. We also have really neat organisms, like this is a larvation or appendicularian, and this organism belongs to the same phylum that we do. It is a chordate, which means it has a backbone. Now it's a very primitive form of chordate. It has a sort of what's called a notochord, but it's more closely related to us as humans than it is to, say, those copepods or those snails that I just showed you. And so even in the plankton, we can find very, very close relatives evolutionarily to us. And this is one example. And these ones are really, really interesting because when people see them under the microscope, it reminds them of a brain with a little spinal cord swimming around. And they're pretty nifty looking. As the video said, we also have some of the largest and longest animals on Earth. These are salps. And salps are actually quite tiny, but what they build is a large mucus house or barrel, and they live inside this barrel and they filter feed. And in order to avoid being eaten by things like sea turtles, they will form these large colonies, and these can stretch for hundreds of meters. So you can see this, this diver here in relation to these salps is quite long, and these colonies can form very large blooms. And we find these in Alaska waters sometimes. And they seem to be a boom or bust. There tends to be a lot of them, or then they disappear. And so very interesting creatures. And then some of my favorites are the ones that are bioluminescent. This is a ctenophore, and that comes from the Greek for bearer of combs. So we call this a comb jelly, and it has a set of flagella that beat in unison in order to move it around, and those are the combs that you see. And it's also bioluminescent. So whenever we capture these species in the net, we actually see a lot of bioluminescence going on. And most of the new people that come out to sea with us really enjoy looking at these creatures. It's almost mesmerizing when you see them under the microscope. And so that's a big, wide-ranging introduction. So I'm going to pause now and open it up for anyone has any questions.
All right. Well, yeah, that was a wide variety of plankton. And we did get a question from Michelle asking, are whale lice plankton? Because I think that
Yeah.
one of the other, the pictures that you showed looked a little bit like whale lice.
Yeah, whale lice are plankton. They are one of those species that has a larval stage that kind of swims around in the plankton, and then when it finds a host like a whale, it will attach. And so, yeah, whale lice are plankton. And essentially, once they attach, that's it. They're going to survive on the surface of the whale's skin. And then when they reproduce, their young, their eggs will go back into the plankton and they'll attempt to find a new whale.
Great. And then Laura was wondering, you had talked about salps being those colonial plankton that attach together. And
Yes.
so Laura was asking, how long can a salp get? And I have a couple other questions associated with that as well, but I'll let you answer that one first. How long can a salp get?
Yeah, salps can be, if you think of a football field long, that's how long a colony of salps can be. Essentially 300 feet or 100 yards or so they can get. And there's also some jellyfish that are considered planktonic that can be the size of a car. And those are the Japanese giant jellyfish that are considered planktonic because they can't swim against the current, but they're quite large. So these organisms can range from single cells all the way up to the size of a small car.
Wow, that's something new to me. I had not realized that jellyfish could get that large. So you had mentioned with the salps that they could be boom or bust, that sometimes there's lots of them and other times that there aren't any. And are there any oceanographic conditions that are associated with that boom or bust?
Yeah, so we're still trying to figure that out because salps are very difficult to sample because they're gelatinous. And so if we drag a net to sample them, we often destroy them. So we have to come up with some different ways using video technology and things. And what we think is when there's a very large amount of algal growth in the environment, salps tend to do well because they're strong filter feeders. So what they do is they filter out this algae that's in the environment. And so when the algae grows up in a large what we call bloom, the salps often follow to chomp down on that bloom. And then once they eat all the plankton, they tend to disappear, all the algae. So we think that's the case, but tracking them is quite difficult because they're difficult to sample.
Right. I didn't really think about how difficult it would be if they kind of disintegrate as you're trying to pick them up. Adnan had a question about salps as well. They asked, are salps like siphonophores? And so I was wondering whether, first of all, you could define what a siphonophore is and then answer the question.
So a siphonophore is an organism that's related more closely to jellyfish. So they typically are colonial organisms, like a Portuguese man of war is a siphonophore, whereas salps are actually more closely related to chordates, to vertebrates. And so they have a similar mode of planktonic lifestyle, but they feed quite differently. Siphonophores are typically predatory, so they typically have some sort of stinging cell, whereas a salp is more of a filter feeding organism, so it's going to eat particles or algae that's in the water column.
Great. Yeah, that's very interesting. Let's see. So Susan was asking, did you say copepods are the most abundant animal on the planet or in the ocean?
Yeah, I would say on the planet. If you measure all of the individual copepods in the world, there are trillions of them. And so if they're multicellular, so if we take bacteria and singular celled animals out of there or plants out of the equation, I think they are the most abundant animals on the planet as a group. And that's just because if you think about it, the Earth is covered by 70% of it is water, and these animals are existing in the top 200 or 300 meters in very large numbers. So That's why the estimate has been that they are the most abundant animals on the planet. Someone has always argued ants, but ants are, so 30% of the earth is earth. And so I think the copepods win.
One for the zooplankton.
Yep.
So Adnan had also wanted to know, are there parasitic plankton? So we had talked about the whale lice, and I think they're parasitic, right? But are there others?
Yes, actually, most of the copepods are parasitic. So the ones you see that are very abundant and free swimming make up the smallest fraction of the total number of species. The vast majority of them are parasitic and live on other organisms. And the parasites actually go up and down all the different groups, usually contain a subset of organisms that are parasitic. And so if you think about plankton, it's difficult to drift around and it's better to hitch a ride. So a lot of plankton will hitch on to something, whether it's a ship. There's a lot of shipworms that burrow into ships. There's all sorts of organisms that are parasitic.
Great. And Eric was saying that crab legs that are sold in stores have tiny eggs. And he was wondering, are those eggs plankton, or would they be eggs of the crab?
Yeah, it's hard to say unless I saw them, but a lot of times organisms will encrust on anything with a shell. So when we put out instruments, all sorts of plankton, and typically they're barnacles, typically small barnacles will settle on things. So if they're not eggs, they might be some encrusting species that grows on something else. So anytime you put anything out in the water, it will become covered in organisms of all sorts, some of which are planktonic, at least in part of their life stage.
And then Greta was asking, what do copepods eat?
So copepods either eat algae, that is small single-celled plants, or they eat what's called microzooplankton, which would be zooplankton that are smaller than themselves, and they'll also eat each other. So a lot of copepods are predatory, so they will prey upon smaller sized plankton that they can grasp and capture. A lot of them are filter feeders, though, where they will simply be like cows. They will graze on plants.
Wow. And actually, Carl had a question that was related to your previous answer about parasitic copepods. He was asking, are there parasitic copepods that live on other larger copepods?
So we think that is the case. We haven't found any directly, mostly because copepods tend to be pretty small. So in order to have another copepod live on one, it would have to be tiny. But some of the larger ones probably do have some associated plankton that live on them. I don't know if copepods parasitize others, but I have seen copepods that have ciliates that live on them. They attach to their outer shell, and they sort of will live on them as a substrate or a place to attach.
That's really interesting. And then AV wanted to know, are there plankton in freshwater? Because we've been talking mostly about marine water here.
Absolutely. Most of your lakes that you've ever been in will be teeming with plankton. So yeah, plankton are basically ubiquitous. Any body of water that you go into is likely going to be loaded with both phytoplankton, which are plant, usually single-celled organisms, and then as well as zooplankton.
Great. And actually, you could probably test that by just going down to your local lake and putting a net in the water and seeing what you find.
Absolutely. One of the easiest ways to do that, if you want, is just get yourself some pantyhose and stretch it over a small hoop and just drag that through the water, and then take that and put it under a microscope or at least a little bit of water and watch the stuff swim around. You'll be surprised how much plankton's in there.
Very cool. One last question before we go on to your next section is how did you get interested in studying zooplankton?
Yeah, so when I was an undergraduate in the middle of Pennsylvania, we weren't near that many oceans, but I did take a course where we went to Virginia and did some sampling off the coast of Virginia, and that's when I first saw a plankton net dragged, and I was hooked when this net came up and we put the contents under the microscope, and there was this entire world that I had never really known existed. And that's how I got interested in trying to understand about this small world. And then when I found out how important they are, as hopefully you'll see in the rest of the talk, I was definitely hooked as something I wanted to study.
Great. Well, I know that you have a lot more to share with us, so maybe we should go on to our next section.
All right, great questions, everyone. Okay. So why are plankton so important? I mean, why would Alaska Fisheries Science Center hire somebody like myself to go out and study plankton? And one of the reasons is where plankton sit in the food web. So if you see where I'm highlighting over there in the right beneath ice algae is zooplankton. And what I want you to notice is how many arrows are going to and from the zooplankton. And that's because zooplankton are serving as a very important link in the food web. They feed on the phytoplankton, and the phytoplankton are the ones that take carbon dioxide and sunlight and turn it into energy. But once zooplankton feed on phytoplankton, pretty much everybody else eats zooplankton, whether it's seabirds, whether it's whales, whether it's fish, whether it's jellyfish. At any given time, zooplankton are basically a food item for all these different species. And even if they don't feed on them directly, if they feed on an organism that's fed upon zooplankton, then zooplankton have this very important role of moving energy through the food web. So you can think of them as like a gatekeeper. The energy is coming into phytoplankton and they're moving it up the food web, often directly to very large predators like whales and seabirds. Okay. And the reason that's important is we rely on this, okay? We can't fish in the environment unless these fish, as they start out in their lives as eggs, they will hatch into larvae, and from that point until they get a little bit older, they feed almost entirely on zooplankton. And so in order for us to harvest them in the commercial fishery on the left there, these fish have to survive their younger years, and they do that by eating zooplankton. It's the same with subsistence. Here you're looking at someone drying their salmon catch, and salmon spend a long part of their lives out in the ocean. And a lot of what they eat is zooplankton. And before they come into the rivers to spawn, that is where they get a lot of their energy. So this energy that people are using to subsist on, a lot of it comes through the zooplankton food web. So it's important to understand what's happening with zooplankton in the environment. And so what do we do? And what we do is we want to look at zooplankton in the environment. We want to measure how many individuals and what types of zooplankton are there. And then we want to keep an eye on them. If they're changing, what does that mean for us? So what we do is we go out in the environment, and I'll show you some pictures from our research vessel. And we collect zooplankton, and we look at them under the microscope, we measure them, we identify them, and then over time, we look at whether their populations are increasing or decreasing or changing what they're made up of. And we use that information to tell individuals that are involved in setting fishing quotas, setting how many fish we can take from the environment, that if the zooplankton population is declining, then perhaps we should think about reducing the amount of fish we take out of the environment, because if there isn't enough zooplankton, there won't be enough fish. And so it's important for us to monitor these populations. So how do we do that? Well, we go to sea. And this is our vessel called the Oscar Dyson. Its home port is in Kodiak. And that's a picture of me somewhere in the Gulf of Alaska. And so we hop on this vessel a few times a year. And the way we sample zooplankton is to drag these nets. And so this net we call a bongo because it has two nets and it sort of looks like a bongo drum. And we drag this net, and the net has a very fine mesh. The mesh on this net is about 500 micrometers, or 1/2 of a millimeter, or pretty tiny. So the screen on your windows, maybe in your house or in your apartment, is about 1 millimeter, so a little bit half that size. And then the ship will drag the net for us for a while. It goes down deep and it comes back. And then on the deck, we wash the net down. And then we take that sample and we go into the laboratory and we will look at the zooplankton under the microscope. We'll try to identify the different types. And then what you're looking at here on the right, those are fish larvae. These are walleye pollock larvae, and they're considered planktonic because they can't swim against the currents when they're young. And so this is our first look at what the actual amount of larvae for a particular fish species might look like in a given year. So we'll look at this stuff under the scope, we'll take some measurements, and then I will note that this is hard to do sometimes, so I'm going to switch over to another video just to show you what it's like to be at sea. And hopefully everyone can find their window and see this. I'm going to run this real fast, but sometimes it's a little bumpy.
I have a question of whether you ever get seasick when you're out on the ship.
The answer is no. I don't typically get seasick, but sometimes we say that every sailor has their sea. So when it gets really bad out, it gets most of us eventually. So this one wasn't so bad since I was out taking a video from the ship, but I've been in other times where I was not out on the deck, I was in my bunk. So definitely. So it's a lot of fun. I love going to sea. I'm actually going to sea in 2 weeks into the Bering Sea. And we're usually out for about 3 weeks, and you get to see some really gorgeous things like these great sunsets. And also we cover large amounts of ground. So this is a map of the Alaska Peninsula. And you can see all those little X's and circles are all the stations where we collected plankton. And so that's a large area because that island there is Kodiak, and that's the size of the state of Connecticut. So very large amount of area that we cover, and that's me looking very happy after spending 3 weeks at sea, coming into the port of Kodiak on a nice sunny day. So I'll stop here for some more questions before we move on, and hopefully you were able to see the video. If it didn't go, I apologize.
Okay, so Greta was asking, are the plankton dead when you look at them, when you bring them up in the net?
So when we bring them up in the net, they are not dead. They typically are alive. They may be a little traumatized from being captured at depth and brought to the surface, but they are still alive. So we often preserve one sample. So we'll add some what we call formalin or formaldehyde to the sample so we can count and preserve the organisms later. Some of the others we will actually count right on board the ship, and then we will return them to the ocean. So the second net gets a little bit of quick run through, and then they go back into the ocean.
I also had another question about the picture that you showed with the larval pollock. If you get do you try to get an estimate of, you know, percentages of different types of plankton that you pull up, so that if in 1 year you get lots and lots of pollock and not much of something else, that's noteworthy?
Yeah, we absolutely do that. So one of the reasons we do a survey during the spring is to look at all the fish larvae and determine how many there are, what percentage of them are of particular species, and if there's a year where we have very low larval numbers, that serves as a warning that perhaps that particular year class of fish might not be very strong. So we might want to keep an eye on that particular fishery moving forward. So yes, that's a very good question. That's exactly what we do. And then for the plankton, the zooplankton themselves that aren't fish larvae, we're looking to see, are the right types of plankton there that fish like to feed on? And if they're not there, what does that mean for the ecosystem? And so that's a really good question because it talks about what I'll be talking about next.
Okay, and then Michelle was wondering, can plankton live in deep water?
Absolutely. Some of the most interesting plankton in the world live in very deep water. So most of the ocean is around 4,000 meters deep. So as we go very far down into the deeper waters, we still find abundant numbers of plankton. And some of the weirdest creatures on Earth are living at those depths. And a lot of the plankton are red. believe it or not, at those depths. And that's because that's the one shade of light that they can really use to camouflage themselves. So when they're up in the surface waters and there's lots of light, they tend to be transparent because they don't want to be seen. But when they're way down in the deep and you have luminescent predators flashing, they tend to turn red. It's quite interesting to see them. So, but yeah, they're found as deep in the ocean as you can go. You still find plankton.
So that actually brings up another interesting question of how do you have nets that sample at specific depths for plankton?
Yes, we do. We have a couple different devices that can open and close nets at different depths. So if we're interested in looking at, say, things that are very deep in the water column, we just send the net down, and then we have an electronic signal that will go down and open and close different nets. And then we have different devices depending on what depth we want to get to. The deeper we go, the more pressure we have. So we need some very specialized devices to open and close nets if it's very, very deep. So it just depends on how deep you want to go. However, most of the activity for plankton occurs in the upper 100 meters because that's where the sunlight is. So oftentimes we don't sample super deep unless we're interested in things like particular fish larvae that are planktonic and are very deep in the water column.
Oh, that's interesting. It makes me think about elevators and how your nets are kind of like elevators to the different depths.
Yeah, one of the big net systems we have is called MOCNESS. We call it the MOCNESS Monster, and that stands for Multiple Open and Closing Net System. And it has 8 different nets. And so you can sample 8 different depths by sending an electronic signal down to open and close. And they're a bit like sliding elevator doors. So
very interesting. So Stephen was wondering, do you try to come up with a density or count of creatures per unit of volume? And
absolutely, yeah.
Is it density by species or density as a whole?
So we do both, but that's what we do. We try to estimate the total number of individuals per cubic meter or liter of water. And then we do an estimate for the total. In other words, how much actual plankton are in a particular net, for example, or we do it by species to say how abundant are these animals compared to, say, a year ago, or in the spring compared to fall, or 10 years ago. And that's how we keep track of these populations.
Very cool. There was also another question about that map you showed with all of the X's for the stations, because they were wondering how long does it take to do one of those stations, and then how long does it take to do that whole survey where you're doing all of those X's?
Right, so typically a station takes about an hour. We will stop, we will do a water sample first and then a plankton sample. And so if you're on shift, you work a 12-hour shift, you typically do 11 to 12 of those stations a day, and we work around the clock. So the number of stations that we did there was about 270 or so, something like that, maybe less. And that takes about 3 weeks because we do have transit times that we go in between different places and some different activities. So that particular cruise, I believe, was about 23 days total.
So you said that you take a water sample first and then a plankton sample. So why do you take the water sample?
So the water sample is we have an instrument called a CTD, which stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth, and that measures the temperature and salinity of the water. It also has a frame that has water bottles on it. And so when we collect the water from different depths, we'll measure the amount of nutrients in it, and we'll measure the amount of phytoplankton in it. And so that gives us a sense of the physical nature of the water, how salty, how warm or cold it is. It gives us a nature of how much nutrient is in it. And then that tells us how much phytoplankton can grow. And then we measure the amount of phytoplankton, and then that's part one of the station. And the second part is to measure the zooplankton. So that's what we call ecosystem work, where we're trying to measure across a broad suite of measurements to tell us something about the ecosystem.
And then what you can do is you can take the measurements that you take from the water and relate them to how many zooplankton you see in the different areas. Is that right?
That is correct. All of that information goes into our understanding about why zooplankton populations change over time and what conditions are favorable, what aren't. And by putting that all together, we get a picture of what's happening in the ecosystem as the year progresses.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That reminds me of something that one of our previous speakers, Lance Kramer, had said when he was talking about subsistence lifestyle around Kotzebue and talking about how everything started with the ice algae. And if there's a lot of ice algae, then there's a lot of algae for the zooplankton to feed on. And then that means that the zooplankton are fat and happy. And that means that all of the other animals in the food chain can feed on them. So that kind of underlines what you're talking about with how important zooplankton are to the food web.
Absolutely. Everything starts with the algae, but as I said, the zooplankton are the gateway to the rest of the food web. So many organisms in the Arctic rely on this ice algae because it grows around the year. And that ice algae is then transferred by zooplankton either up to higher levels in the food web, or some of that algae falls to the bottom where creatures on the bottom eat it. So things like gray whales and walrus will also benefit from that algae falling to the bottom because they eat those mollusks and other creatures that live on the bottom.
Very interesting. So Beth Q had a question about how long have you been collecting data like this, and have you seen any changes?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the talk. We've been collecting data in Alaska as far back as the 80s in the Gulf of Alaska to present. So we have somewhere in the neighborhood of a 35 to 40 year time frame where we have data that we can talk about the system. And yes, we have seen a lot of changes over time. And I'll begin. Yep.
Maybe that's a good lead into your next section.
Sure, let's talk about that. Let's keep going. So, great question, because this tells us the system is changing. And so this is just a satellite picture of the Bering Sea. And what you see in the top here, this part where it says Chukchi Sea, that's the Bering Strait that leads into the Arctic. And this is the ice cover on April of 2014. And then roughly 5 years later, I can't see that. Oh yes, 5 years later in 2019, and you can see what's happening is the system is warming and we're getting less ice. And this is quite a dramatic picture because the waxing and waning of the ice is very important for the Bering Sea, for what Lisa just said about the presence of ice algae forming a very important base of the food web. So what we've seen over time is fluctuations in this ice. And those fluctuations are leading to less ice, which is leading to some consequences in the ecosystem. And what we've seen recently is what we call marine heat waves or warm spells. And what happens is the water gets warmer. And so these cool colors over here begin to disappear. The water warms up a lot at the surface, and that warm water goes deeper. And this actually really impacts the zooplankton because they are cold-blooded. And since they're cold-blooded, the warmer it gets, the faster their metabolism goes. And what happens is they tend to get smaller and they tend to change what species are there. So this big copepod on the right here, Hyperboreus, is an Arctic species. And you notice this big glob in its body, that's fat. And the reason I have a piece of bacon over here is that each of these organisms is about 65% fat. And that's the same as if you eat one piece of bacon, 65% of your calories from that piece of bacon are going to come from fat. In contrast, this really small copepod over here has a lot less fat, only 1 to 2% of its body mass. So if you're a fish or you're a whale or a bird, if the system changes and we get a lot less fat copepods with lots of bigger fat globules in them, then the fish have less nutritious food, and any predators that feed on those fish and zooplankton are in trouble. And that's what we've seen. This is a picture from Nome in August of 2019, that year where we had very little ice and we had a large bird die-off in some of these years. And people attribute this to the fact that the amount of zooplankton in the system changes, and the amount of fat or nutritious food available to the food web changes when we get warmer. And so these changes have consequences, and that's why we want to measure these things. We want to know what it's like when it's cold, know what it's like when it's warm. And so this little graphic shows you in years where it's really cold, you see we have these large zooplankton. They tend to hang around for longer periods of time, and they tend to store a lot of fat. So that's like the bacon of the ocean. And that really helps fish in a really important time. The first year of a fish's life is very fraught with danger, and they need to make it over the winter. So they eat these zooplankton, they put on a lot of fat, and that helps them survive the winter. But as the regime shifts, and that means it goes from colder to warmer, and we call that a regime shift, it becomes warmer, and these zooplankton become skinnier. They might even become more abundant, but they're different, and they have a little bit less fat in them, and that impacts the amount of energy that overwintering fish can have, and that lowers their survival. And so, as you can imagine, if this impacts the zooplankton, everyone else in the food web is impacted. And so that's why we keep an eye on this, these zooplankton populations. So that's what I was alluding to at the end. What can you guys tell me about what would happen if Alaska didn't have any zooplankton in its waters?
So what do you guys think, all of you guys in the audience, what do you think would happen in Alaskan waters if zooplankton just disappeared? Or just based on what Dave was talking about just now in terms of, you know, when the water is warmer, the zooplankton are smaller and have less energy. What do you think would happen to the waters, the ecosystem as a whole? So Jasper from Juneau is saying that there would be no animals because they wouldn't have anything to eat. And Kyle Jordan and Kaylee are also saying there would eventually be no fish because they wouldn't have enough food to eat. And Michelle is saying that the whales would starve. So there's a lot of ecosystem impacts here, it sounds like.
For sure, you guys are very sharp. So let me show you. What we're noticing in the ecosystem is that if we don't have zooplankton, some of our very favorite animals are in trouble. So what we see is endangered species, like this is the North Pacific right whale. It's one of the most endangered animals on the planet. The estimate is that there's only 30 species or 30 individuals of the North Pacific right whale left, and they feed exclusively on copepods. So they come to the Bering every year and they feed on that copepod that we call Calanus. That's the one that has all that fat in it at the end of the year. And so I'm working with someone at Duke University who also gave a NOAA Live seminar here before, Dana Wright, and we're looking at the populations of zooplankton in relation to this whale. Also on the bottom is subsistence. That's a bowhead whale. That's a commonly hunted whale in the area near Utqiagvik. And they feed primarily on the same copepod and krill. And so that's the direct impact of these zooplankton on these species. Then we have endangered seabirds. This is the Laysan albatross. It's another very endangered species that nests close to Japan, but feeds out in the Bering. And a lot of birds either feed on zooplankton directly, like mirrors, or they feed on small fish that rely almost completely on zooplankton. So as we see from before, we've seen some impacts with bird die-offs, and those have been happening as we get these marine heat waves. And then finally, commercial fisheries. So that's walleye pollock, which is a big fishery in Alaska, but a recent one that has had trouble is one called Pacific cod in the Gulf of Alaska. And we started noticing a few years before Pacific cod had some issues in the fishery that we saw no larvae for Pacific cod, very few zooplankton during a warm wave, and we sounded the warning that this might be a problem for this fish. And so that impacts not only commercial, but subsistence living. There's many people that rely on not only fish, but marine mammals for their protein. And so without zooplankton, we would have a major problem, as all of you rightly pointed out. Without zooplankton, we would lose that important link in the food web, and we would have a major impact on some of these species that we really care about. So I think that's my last slide. So I'll end there, and I'll be happy to spend some time answering more questions. I hope you all enjoyed.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave. That was very interesting and a lot of interesting information and beautiful pictures. I did have one question, which is, what is your favorite kind of zooplankton?
Oh, that's a tough one. My favorite kind of zooplankton. I think I really like those comb jellies. They're really fascinating to me, and they're not very well studied, but I really like the bioluminescence, and I really like that they are voracious predators. So they are one of the most interesting animals in that they don't have a saturated food response. And what I mean like that is, imagine if you went to the buffet, eventually you eat enough and you say, well, I'm full, I can't eat anymore. Comb jellyfish don't do that. They eat nonstop. They have, as far as we can tell, they do not saturate when they feed. So in other words, you just keep giving them more plankton, they just keep eating. Now they get pretty bad at assimilating all that energy, but they're very effective at eating. And so there was a species that was introduced into the Black Sea by accident, and it ate all of the zooplankton in the Black Sea. And what happened is the entire food web collapsed. And so any very small gelatinous organism that can have that kind of an impact is pretty fascinating to me. So.
Wow, that's interesting. I was imagining that if they don't get saturated, if they keep on eating and eating, that they would get bigger. They would grow out of that, wouldn't they? Do they get very big?
So they do, but they have a terminal size. So they don't like balloon in massive size. They just reproduce. So as they keep feeding, they're basically turning a lot of that energy into eggs, and those eggs create more comb jellyfish who eat more and produce more eggs, and that's what happened. And so we think, at least the theory is that in the ballast water of a ship from somewhere else in the world, stopped in the Black Sea, changed its ballast water, and that organism got introduced in the environment and ate everything that was there because it had no predator.
Wow. Wow. That's a picture that's pretty interesting to think about. So Greta was asking, do narwhals eat zooplankton?
I don't think so. I actually don't know the answer to that question, but my guess is they do not eat zooplankton, but I don't know. I will have to write that down and get back to you, but I don't think so. I think they're predatory, if I had to guess, on fish, but
Yeah, I
don't
think
know.
that they eat fish as well. And so Greta, I think that if you probably look it up on Google, you'll be able to figure out whether narwhals eat zooplankton or what their food is. Let's see. So one last question that I have for you, for our viewers out there, is that if you were to look back at yourself as a middle school or an elementary school student, what kind of advice would you give to yourself at that age, or the kids that are watching you on the webinar right now, in terms of what kind of advice would you give them?
That's a great question. My advice would be try everything. I got interested in science. My father was a scientist, but while you're in school, you get the chance to be exposed to all different sorts of things: English, history, arts, science, math. All of that stuff is very, very interesting to me. And I would try to experience as much as I could while I was in school. And that way, when it got time for me to actually choose a career or something I wanted to do for the rest of my life, I made sure that I sampled all the different subjects and things that interested in me. And even though I'm very interested in plankton and I'm a scientist, it's not my only interest. I have lots of other things that I enjoy, like playing guitar and reading and hiking. And so I prefer that if you're young, that you take advantage of that and experience as much as you can, so that when you get to that point where you have to choose, you have a lot to think about.
Great. That's such great advice. And one last question from Greta before we finish off here. She was wondering, how long do plankton live?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Some plankton can live for multiple years. So krill can typically live 2 to 3 years. Some species of copepod can only live for 10 days or so before they go through their life cycle. So it really varies. And then we have some larger species in the Arctic can live 4 or 5 years. It just depends on what type of plankton you're talking about. So some of those colonial individuals can live for quite a long time because they're basically a bunch of single individuals formed into a colony that's kind of turning over all the time. So the actual whole colony can live a long time, but each individual in it might not live that long. So it, you know, it's kind of a, is that a real organism or not? So not sure, but yeah. So they can live for very short periods of time, all the way up to multiple years.
Great. And actually, we had one more question come in, and so we'll just take this one as our last one. Eric was wondering, are copepods the dominant members of zooplankton?
Yes, for the most part, copepods make up in terms of numbers in the 70% range of numbers of plankton. So we study them a lot because there are so many of them, and they are typically the dominant fraction. So yeah, good question.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave, for your very interesting talk. We had a lot of people saying thank you for all of the information that you gave and the beautiful pictures. And I really learned a lot myself just watching your talk. So I wanted to thank our audience members for coming into our webinar, and we will be having next week's webinar coming up soon. We'll have Patuk from Ukqiagvik talking with us, and so please come back next week to see what else we have on tap. So thank you very much, Dave, and thank you to our audience, and we will see you next week.
Thank you all. Great questions. I hope you all enjoyed them.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.